Well, kia ora and welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today for World Fish Migration Day. We have people from different countries and interest groups with various levels of experience in the fish passage space. While some folk are concerned about large structures such as dams, today's webinar is looking at the multitude of smaller structures scattered across the landscape. The presentation is in 4 short parts, so sit back and hold on tight and we'll get stuck into it. Please note that this presentation does not target specific species of fish. Each section of waterway will have naturally selected the aquatic species present based on the overall characteristics of that particular waterway. Conversely, each species will select the waterway that best suits its particular swimming and habitat requirements. These tools and methodologies take the stream simulation approach, where the hydrological characteristics can easily be measured or observed and ideally replicated. The key message: if bed material is retained within a structure, it is unlikely to be a barrier for fish. Part 1. So what do fish actually need to migrate? Well, obviously they need sufficient depth for their particular body shape or type. They need complex flows and or low velocities, wetted margins, splash zones for climbing species that may be outside of the main flow. Ideally they have pools to rest and feed, particularly if they're drift feeders and the food comes to them. They need bed materials, always a good thing and a good measure of the success of remediation. And smooth edges are ideal, particularly for the likes of lamprey. And in this world, typically the biggest challenge is upstream migration. The structural challenges that impede fish that we see out there in the landscape: we see perched or overhanging pipes, perched and overhanging aprons and flumes that are often on the end of pipes. Sometimes it's just the fact that it's a very long culvert or a steep culvert. We have weirs and gravel traps, sometimes in quite large rivers. And flat gates or tide gates are often the first barrier that fish will encounter as they're making their way inland from the ocean or estuaries. Porous riprap, that's part of your erosion control. Often when it's put in, there's no surface flow, so the water disappears underneath. And sharp horizontal edges make it a real challenge for some species. The hydrological challenges that impede fish uniform or laminar flows over smooth surfaces, and this is most of your culverts fall into that category. High velocities above and beyond what any given fish can swim against. Areas of high aeration or bubbles or whitewater turbulence, which can be hard for fish to get traction to make their way up. A lack of pools to rest and feed. A lack of wetted margins or splash zones, and shallowing with no low flow path. And a lot of these structures that you can see here are the sort of thing that you might drive over on the way to work each day and not even know that they exist, but there's thousands of them out there. So the second part, we're now looking at how to effectively assess these structures in a logical, managed way, rather than just one here and one there. So we, over the last few years, have developed an app for a mobile device where we collect all different attributes. And then an output of that is a series of dots on a map, essentially with a metadata, which gives us the ability to sort the structures by different categories. So we attribute everything a status once we've got an idea that there's something out there. And these statuses are still evolving, but currently we use a 0 for one that's not assessed, because it's just a dot on a map or a target that's been generated as a desktop exercise. The next one is the one we all love, is number 1, not currently a barrier. Now that may change over time, but that's been deemed by a number of means to be currently not a barrier to fish. Number 2 is where fish passage remediation has been fitted and has targeted all species. And number 3 is where fish passage remediation has been fitted, but we're only targeting the climbing species, and there can be a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is that we're only expecting climbing species in that particular location. Number 4 describes a barrier that's perched or overhung. Number 5 is a velocity barrier. And number 6 is quite common, where it's both. Number 7 we use for physical barriers like tide gates. Number 8 is where we haven't been able to get enough information to make the call, so we deem that to require further investigation. Number 9 we put there as a natural feature because a lot of people like to record those, and they may or may not be barriers to different species of fish. Number 10 is where we have no aquatic habitat upstream, or it's dry, so it's unlikely that fish are going to need to get through there. Number 11 is requires maintenance, because we come across structures occasionally that are in a bad state of repair, and that's probably the first thing that's going to happen to them, is that they get maintained, and therefore we can hopefully accommodate fish passage during that maintenance process, or attach something after the fact. This is a list of the attributes that we collect, and that's also growing depending on local authority requirements. I won't read them all out. The ones that are in bold are the minimum, and the other ones are just help us with better understanding the structure and the environment that it is in. The third part is what are the measures of successful installation or remediation? And this is important if you're trying to comply with various regulations. What we look at it as is a challenge to match or better the hydrological characteristics of the waterway in which the structure is installed. That means the fish will have several choices across a range of flows. There's the likely retention of bed material. Obviously, target fish observed upstream after remediation are a measure of success. So match or better, what does that actually mean? We've broken it into different elements or attributes. When we're talking about the gradient or the slope, why is it a problem? Well, obviously the steeper the culvert or structure, the faster the flow over it, and it's harder for the fish to get up there, and we're less likely to retain bed material. So match or better means, and as far as gradient goes, we want to be the same or less than the adjacent stream, meaning the section of stream adjacent to the culvert, upstream or downstream. How are we going to achieve this? Well, with new structures, a lot of it's about design and the culvert length and alignment and size. The installation, how the people on the day actually install it, which takes into account the gradient and the entrance and exit. And to enhance that, if there's any doubt that we're going to achieve it right from the get-go, then there's an option of installing baffles even in a new structure. As far as depth and width goes, including low flow channels, why is it a problem? Well, obviously fish need a minimum depth, as we mentioned earlier, to be able to swim. Match or better means we want to be the same depth or deeper and as wide or wider than the adjacent stream. So how do we achieve that? With new structures, we design culvert size selection. Wider culverts are more likely to retain bed material. The installation, and ideally to embed it into the stream to retain that bed material. And with existing structures, the remediation tool in that space to get width or depth in particular is the use of baffles and maybe a downstream weir to backwater. Velocity, well, this is a bit of a no-brainer. Fish obviously find it more difficult swimming the higher the velocity. Also, there's more likelihood of any bed material that's been retained being flushed out. So match or better means the same or lower velocities in the adjacent stream. And we achieve that again with design and installation, and we can use baffles and downstream weir. So what we're seeing is a bit of a theme here where a lot of the design elements or remediation is actually the same, in as much as you can achieve a multitude of outcomes from one or more of the tools in the toolbox, like baffles and the mussel-rope. And there's some good examples down there of showing baffles in culverts or in an open fish pass. And the rope on the right is down a steep, relatively low flow culvert. So this one is a little bit more interesting in the sense we're talking about flow dynamics. And why is it a problem? Well, as you saw earlier on, there were laminar flow makes it harder for fish to swim long distances, and fish have evolved to take advantage of the complex flows that occur in a natural environment with rest pools and different widths and depths, and that complexity occurs right down through the water column, not just horizontally. And fortunately, we can achieve this through good design and installation, and add-ons such as baffles and the likes to try and create a more natural environment with the complexities of flow. Outfalls are a very common problem, typically overhanging culverts or steep vertical faces on weirs and aprons and the like. And if we're going to improve that, well then ideally we eliminate or reduce the amount of the drop or overhang. And this can be achieved with backwatering if you're lucky, but you've got to be mindful that a backwatering structure like a downstream weir in itself can become a barrier to fish or be blown out in a flood event. So we've developed the floating ramps for some situations. They're a little bit more expensive than the third option, which is a rubber ramp. And it depends a little bit on the species or the range of species and their swimming ability and any given site as to whether we use a rubber ramp or a floating ramp. The photo on the bottom right gives you an example of where a series of downstream weirs have been put in to help backwater that box culvert. So looking specifically at the toolbox that we've developed and are continuing to develop, the focus is on low cost in terms of the actual material, but also ease of installation, because it can be quite a large cost that comes with that, especially when you take into account heavy machinery and health and safety and traffic management and that type of thing. But these are the current tools in the toolbox, and we'll go over them one by one. We've got the floating ramps, the culvert baffles, mussel ropes, which most of you will have heard of, rubber ramps, fish-friendly tide gates, and the tunnel houses and planter pods. So the floating ramps, as I alluded to just before, are a roto-molded plastic ramp with or without a tactile surface. We can use ropes instead of that dimpled sheeting, and there's pros and cons in both. Typically, two people can install those in under half an hour, and they can be used in conjunction with baffles. You'll see on the left-hand photograph there is a piece of conveyor belt rubber used as a hinge, and the bottom end just floats in the plunge pool and goes up and down depending on the water levels. The photo on the right shows a small elver about almost 200 millimeters long, making its way up a ramp after installation. We use either half ramps or full ramps depending on the amount of drop. Flexible culvert baffles are a great new tool in the toolbox. They can be used in a number of applications on round or flat surfaces, and of course they bend over during high flows or when debris is passing through, so thereby greatly reducing the chance of causing a blockage and maintaining the capacity of the culvert. Mussel ropes are something that have been used for a while and are very effective, particularly in long, narrow culverts that you can't climb into to put baffles. They're installed just by being attached at the upstream end, so there's no danger of a debris jam. And we also nowadays use the looped mussel rope like the one that's on the close-up on the right-hand side, because we are mindful of not wanting to have any plastic filaments end up in the environment. While mussel ropes are good and relatively cheap, they obviously don't provide rest pools or help with bed material retention. So we always use baffles when we can, and mussel ropes are just a last-ditch option. Rubber ramps are a robust, low-cost option when dealing with overhanging culverts or aprons, and can be used in conjunction with mussel rope to good effect. Tide gates can often be the first barrier that fish encounter on their upstream migration, and can also greatly affect water quality. We have developed a number of options for both existing and new tide gates to essentially delay the closing moment. It is important that tide gates are finely adjustable, as each site will be able to cope with different amounts of tide differential upstream as a result of the delayed closing. Tunnel houses are a great way of introducing refuge within a hard structure like a culvert. Vegetation can be introduced to hard structures using planter pots, which in themselves host a variety of plants that can bring shade, bring some habitat, some refuge, and even some food supply. So let's look at the benefits of low-cost retrofit remediation. Obviously, you've got your low-cost components. So typically a really fast install, and we can do up to 10 sites a day. There's minimal impact on the waterway, so we're not worried about sediment control and the likes. We re-establish connectivity of the waterway immediately. It's usually a permitted activity, so no consent or permit required. It's simple health and safety. It doesn't require heavy machinery, no expensive design process. Items can be modified to suit on site, and no disruption to the traffic or public above. So thanks again for taking part in this World Fish Migration Day webinar. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us directly.